presentation to make sure that it is available for you to view later, as well as others to see on our YouTube channel. But today's presentation, we are focusing on safe mobility, in particular for persons with disabilities. And of course, this has always been an important topic, but we are making sure that we highlight this a bit more because we're finding in our practice that we could do a better job of including this population. And we'd like to hopefully support others in also doing the same. So during today's presentation, I will be your lead facilitator, kind of guiding us through the presentation portion, and then we will have time for a Q&A in order to go over any questions that you have about what we covered, or just any conversation in general about this topic. But before we get started, I do want to see who is in attendance today. And so I'm going to be launching just a quick poll, and this is just to see who we have here. We want to know, do you work in transportation? Are you a community advocate, or are you just an interested resident or student? So if you don't mind just taking a quick second and doing this for us. I'll leave this open. Great, so far I'm seeing transportation related profession and then a couple of community advocates, excellent. Okay, so I will end that poll. Terrific. So it sounds like you have some background in transportation, which is great. So as we dive through, feel free to use the chat feature and you can enter your questions in there. Or if we stay a small enough group, we'll be sure that we can kind of take yourself off mute and have a discussion afterwards. But let's go ahead and dive right in. So before we jump into kind of this topic of persons with disabilities, I find that it's really important to let you know what we do at Circulate San Diego, because that really kind of sets us up for talking about how we're supporting all populations that we work with. So how our organization is set up is we're kind of this two arms organization. We have a planning and education programs team. So I'm myself, Jane Schwartz. I am one of the planning staff, and we're accompanied today by Angelica and Octavio, who are two other planning staff members. And we focus a lot on mobility assessments, safety campaigns, and community engagement. It's really the planning-oriented, program-oriented work. And then the other arm of our organization looks at policy and advocacy. And so you may see that portion in the news a little bit more, with really trying to make overarching change when it comes to safe streets and transit and sustainable growth. So as an organization, we work together and every part is important. But I just wanted to give you this background because we are kind of this policy and implementation side of the equation. So the purpose of today's conversation is really to become more inclusive of persons with disabilities when we are dealing with our planning and our policy work. We want to make sure that our presentations are as inclusionary as possible when it comes to our language and how we're making sure that we include the correct representation, as well as making recommendations for all ability types. We often work in the capacity of being able to provide recommendations or look into what implementation looks like in the planning process. We want to make sure that we're thinking of everyone when we're making those recommendations. And then overall, and very importantly, we want to make sure that we're a better ally. We, of course, in everything that we do, want to be as truthful and supportive as possible. And so it's been really important to look at experts and how we can make sure that our materials and the way that we represent ourselves is as supportive as possible. So before we dive into talking about persons with disability specific cases and programming, I first want to take a look at VisionZero. And if you've attended our other Mobility Monday session on VisionZero, this slide and a few others will look familiar. But I really want to set the stage here with thinking of VisionZero as making sure that our streets are safe for everybody. And so I want to explain that VisionZero is a strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and severe injuries over the next 10 years. It was originally founded and started in Sweden, but overall the message is no loss of life is acceptable, and death on the street does not have to be a part of modern life. And so there's kind of this multidisciplinary approach that comes with making sure that we achieve this VisionZero goal. And the two key components of that is making sure that traffic deaths are preventable and can be fixed, and using this multidisciplinary approach of engineering, education, and enforcement to make sure that we reach that goal. And so the problem is really highlighted because on average, one person a day is seriously injured or killed while walking, bicycling, or driving in San Diego. And traffic fatalities claim the most, almost twice as many lives as homicide in San Diego. And we do recognize that pedestrians are particularly vulnerable. And we have been, over the last 5 years, we have been working on the goal to reach this Vision Zero goal of zero fatalities or serious injuries. And it's something that, as a collective effort, Circulate San Diego is working with partners and jurisdictions to make this possible. But according to city data, we know that there's still very much a problem in San Diego as well as elsewhere. And so that's something that we're working to address. The risk of fatality increases when it comes to vehicle speed. So the faster a vehicle is traveling, the higher risk it is to result in fatality for a pedestrian or a bicyclist. So what this graphic is showing you is a car traveling at 20 miles an hour may result in a fatality at a 10% rate for a pedestrian or a bicyclist. But if a car is traveling at 40 miles an hour, that goes up to 80% for pedestrian or bicyclist. So the problem is safety, both real and perceived, is a major barrier. It's the primary barrier when preventing people from walking and biking. And the speed of cars or insufficient infrastructure like missing sidewalks or unsafe crossings are a few of the concerns. And the reason I set this up as kind of a benchmark of where we're starting this conversation today is what we recognize as those at the greatest risk are vulnerable roadway users. And this includes older adults, persons with disabilities, and children. And so that's why I wanted to start with Vision Zero to kind of let you know that it's a problem that everyone is facing, and we should all be working together to meet these solutions. But we also have to recognize that that the problems meet us each differently, and the vulnerable roadway users, which includes persons with disabilities, is something that we really should do a better job of paying attention to, as we currently are not meeting our Vision Zero goals either as it stands right now. So I included a quote ahead of you, and I do want to read that. So as human beings, we tend to gravitate towards what we know best. It makes us feel comfortable, which can stop us from seeing the world as it is. Thus, blinded, we believe the world exists only in a way that we experience it, and can be difficult for a person without a disability to consider what it would be like to navigate a street for a person with one. So the reason I wanted to include this quote is it really kind of puts us in the mindset that, speaking for myself and also from our organization, is we don't currently operate from thinking about persons with disabilities or older adults or children as kind of the first or population that we're planning for. So that's something that we can do a better job of orienting ourselves to think about that differently. So traditionally with Vision Zero planning, we use two different approaches. And this is how we typically plan and go about kind of reaching our Vision Zero goals. So the two approaches include Safe Smart Users and Safe Smart Design. But we want to know, and what we've really been questioning ourselves is, are these approaches as inclusive as possible for all roadway users, which is inclusive of persons with disabilities? So when it comes to Safe Smart Users, this is talking about riding with the trope. Back up. This is talking about the actual people who are using the facilities or out in the environment, kind of using roadways, using bike lanes. And so in order to be a safe, smart user, this really looks at, you're riding with the flow of traffic, you're wearing a helmet, you're stopping at stop signs, you're using hand signals, you're using lights at night, making sure that you're as reflective as possible so that you can be seen. You're not using your phone to text or call because you want to make sure that you're paying as much attention as possible. You don't ride on the sidewalk because that's a space that, is for pedestrians. And so this is kind of our safe, smart users, our behaviors. And then we go into Safe Smart Design, and there are 3 bullets with Safe Smart Design. And the first one is protecting vulnerable users. And that's followed by creating complete streets as well as slowing down cars. But I want to highlight that always when we see Safe Smart Design, we always know that the first bullet is protect vulnerable users, but how often do we actually kind of sit and think about who that includes, which includes persons with disabilities? So what we did is we know that we are not the experts in kind of this field of looking at what's best for person with disabilities, whether that's visual impairment, physical impairment. And so we actually went and we discussed this slide deck with the Committee for Persons with Disabilities, which is a group through the County of San Diego. They're a great organization, and they really have a kind of a great framework and perspective on mobility needs for all types of, again, persons with disabilities, kind of a spectrum of what those needs are. And so we went through some of the Safe Smart design ideas that we typically use when we're looking at VisionZero solutions. And I wanted to know if these solutions are things that actually work for everybody. And so they're kind of looking at these in a different lens. And again, if you attended the Mobility Monday on VisionZero, these will look familiar, but I just wanted to highlight some of the findings that we had after we met with the Persons with Disabilities Committee, to just let you know some other things that we could be thinking about when we really look at Safe Smart design. So the first is we are looking at protected separated bike lanes. And so this is an example from San Diego, and overall a first impression is this may be a very safe facility. It's off the street, there's limited interaction with intersections, which means limited interaction with vehicles. And overall, I would say this is a pretty safe, comfortable solution for bicyclists, as well as potentially pedestrians if this were to be a shared use path. So at the Committee for Persons with Disabilities, this image came up, and overall they had the same impression of making sure they understood kind of how much it was separated from vehicle traffic. But some of the concerns that came up was thinking of perhaps someone with a visual impairment. How do they know where it would be safe to kind of cross over this bike path, if it were to be a shared use path? So are there certain areas where that would be safe to do so? Someone with a hearing impairment, if there's a bicyclist coming up fast behind, is there perhaps signage that would let them know to make sure that they say very loudly that they're coming up on the left-hand side? So there's just things that we can be more cognizant of from a behavioral standpoint to maybe be a bit more inclusive of your sharing a path with people of all ability types, that maybe we don't want to startle someone if they have a hard time hearing. Those with visual impairments, perhaps we could do a better job making sure that we're not, if we're going at high speeds, that there are safe areas for those crossovers to happen safely. So just a few things to think about, but signage and education around shared use areas was certainly brought up as a main concern. So another solution that we typically talk about are raised crosswalks, and these are generally very great because it brings up the crossing area to the sidewalk level, so it does not require a pedestrian to go down at the street level. And it also requires that cars slow down because essentially they're meeting a speed table that they would have to come up and over. And it also makes a pedestrian more visible because they sit and stand a lot higher than the street level. And so again, overall, this was a very positive reaction to this solution. But things to think about is making sure that there's still detectable warnings, so the yellow bumps before you cross this area, and just thinking through what it's like to actually experience this space as someone that does require those accessible roadway needs. So the detectable warnings, perhaps there's an audible signal to let folks know that it's safe to cross, but really kind of thinking through how could these be more robust and supportive of everybody. So narrowed traffic lanes. There was no complaints here. Overall, very supportive of as much as you can make lanes shorter for pedestrian to cross. That's something that was supported, but very much same rules apply, that making sure that as much of the infrastructure that can be supported of audible systems, as well as detectable warnings, and making sure that just everything is in place so that everyone has kind of equal opportunity of feeling safe in these environments. The lead pedestrian interval. So this is where a pedestrian gets the crossing symbol before a vehicle gets a green light. So it limits the ability for a car to turn quickly in front of someone in the crosswalk. And this was it's maybe perhaps a little less known as an intervention, but overall very very much supported, just as long as there is kind of a longer crossing time. That was something that was brought up, is making sure that there's adequate crossing time available for someone to make it across the street. And so perhaps also looking at this lead pedestrian interval, maybe there's a little bit more time before a vehicle gets a green light, for the pedestrian to get further into the crosswalk. Very much supported, making sure that there's adequate lighting, but even more so making sure that the lighting is designed specifically for pedestrians, so pedestrian scale lighting. Oftentimes poor visibility leads to perceived or real safety concerns, and so just making sure that we avoid all chances of anyone feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. Pothole repair seems very much like a roadway vehicular problem, but it certainly is something to think about for micromobility. And generally we think about it as a concern for bicyclists and perhaps scooters as well. But this came up in discussion about imagining yourself in a wheelchair, that we also have pothole or pothole-like situations on sidewalks, or where there may be asphalt used as a pedestrian path. And so just thinking through how a wheel or a micromobility type may get stuck and be impacted by this type of challenge. And so having pothole repair is very much important for avoiding these hazards and keeping everyone safe. So the rectangular rapid flashing beacons, similarly, there's hawks or pedestrian hybrid beacons, the RHBs. It's all kind of the same idea, but really kind of drawing attention to those in the crosswalk area. Sometimes these are pedestrian activated and sometimes they're not. So pedestrian activated being perhaps there's a button that you can press, where oftentimes if you just kind of stand up to the crossing, it'll change for you. And so in all cases, if there is a button, making sure it's accessible to get to, and as well as if it's just kind of rolling up or walking up to the crossing, that it can be equally identified that someone is there that needs to cross. So making sure that it works and that everyone is recognized. And the last part of this section is mid-block crossings. And so this is generally placed in areas where the crosswalks at intersections are just really separated and a far distance apart from each other. And so putting a mid-block crossing provides a safe, built area for a pedestrian or a cyclist to make a crossing. And then oftentimes there's a pedestrian refuge in the middle, and that's where can be a break area for a pedestrian to kind of navigate one direction of traffic. At two separate instances versus having to cross the whole street at once. So you can cross one segment and kind of pay attention to traffic going one way, and then you can stop and rest and then look for vehicles going the other way. And when working with the Committee for Persons with Disabilities, the Refuge was certainly brought up as a nice facility, because sometimes we move a little bit slower, or you just need a space that kind of limit the number of distractions or things to look for. So that was something that was very much supportive of street infrastructure that would be helpful. So what I just listed, those are slides that probably look familiar if you've seen this presentation before, because those are very typical interventions that we look at, going back to original slides about how we can make our streets safer for everybody, meet our VisionZero goals. But ultimately, what we learned was that it's not perfect and we can do a better job. And there are things that we can expand or learn more about in order to make our infrastructure and behaviors more supportive in general. And so taking this a bit further, we wanted to help ourselves understand what are the accessibility needs and public right-of-way needs. And so we did our own research and talked to some experts about what are the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines and what are required of everyone to make sure that our cities are built and maintained in an accessible way. And so I wanted to share some of these slides with you just as a reminder that while there are accessibility guidelines, we're not always meeting them. And they are guidelines because they're supportive of everyone's physical needs. And so Next couple of slides, I also shared some of these with the Committee for Persons with Disabilities, and I wanted to know what their thoughts are, but then also we skim the surface, and I want to get more into this, and I'll explain it at the end. But where in San Diego, in the county of San Diego, do some of these items that I'll show you, where are they deficient? We want to know kind of what's working and what isn't. So let's jump into some of those. So this is a very kind of standard item. Sidewalk widths. Sometimes there aren't even sidewalks to begin with, but sidewalks are required to be 48 inches wide, and that's continuous. And this is for public right-of-way. And clearly, in my opinion, but in many's opinion, wider is better, allowing for people to kind of cross or walk next to each other in a comfortable way. But then, of course, it's just making sure that pedestrians have a prioritized space along the street, that not everything has to be vehicular oriented. And so this sidewalk width was where we kind of started off as just baseline, kind of basic understanding that sidewalks seem like a very simple intervention for access, but is often overlooked just based on how much available space we're actually providing. And when we say continuous, this is a good example of what we mean, that we want to make sure that the 48 inches stays continuous and clear, even around obstructions. So whether it's a tree or a pole, making sure that a wheelchair or someone in a walker or whatever it may be, it's access for everybody. So even if there isn't someone in a wheelchair, or isn't someone with a walker, this is something that is required and needed. The other thing to think about is passing space. And so this is a bit more specific of using wheelchairs as an example, but in areas, so every 200 feet, there should be a space, whether it's a constructed kind of bump out, which is what the image on the right is showing, or perhaps it's just a wider sidewalk, or it's a part of the intersection, that there should be a 5x5 square that would allow for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other comfortably and not force anyone to accidentally fall into the street or get into the grass area. And so this is just something to think about, again, when we're thinking of sidewalk width, but also just the design of our spaces and the comfortable use of it. So kind of bringing it back to our discussion about the separated bikeway, I tossed in the idea that perhaps we think of it as a shared use path, which some of our bikeways are not that, but along the boardwalk area, we do see shared use paths. And so just something to note is that while width of these shared use paths is something that is determined by use, and so it's a shared use path or a sidewalk, and so the width is kind of determined within that, the accessibility is not controlled in that sense. And so what I mean by that is, as you can see in this picture, a bunch of people are using the path, and that's great. It's a width based on the fact that it is deemed a shared use path, so it has to be at least 10 feet wide, but the uses of those paths and the accessibility that's required is not something that's controlled. So if you have a wheelchair that is also using this path along the side of these pedestrians, the rollerblader, the bicyclist, it gets a little bit jumbled and is harder to navigate. And so just thinking through the accessibility and comfort of use for all ability types and all users is not something that we typically think about, and is certainly not regulated. And so just making sure that, one, the width meets the use area, but then taking a step further and thinking about who the user groups are, even if it's not a requirement of the built construction of it. So then our next couple of slides are about slope. And the reason this is brought up is we live in San Diego, as well as many cities and other places of the country have hills and topography that can be very challenging for someone with mobility needs. And so the grade of a sidewalk should not exceed that of the roadway next to it. And thinking about kind of how steep or what the terrain looks like, and putting yourself into the position of thinking, if you're pushing yourself in a wheelchair up this hill, or even going down the hill, what stopping would look like. And then certainly, the whole spectrum of just all needs and abilities and what that looks like for the comfort and safety of all. So when we talk about cross slope, this is kind of getting into the idea of making sure that we're steady on our feet, or again, in kind of a wheelchair, making sure that we're as secure as possible. And so there is a need for slope in order to make sure that water can run off sufficiently. If it's raining, we don't want big puddles to gather. And so while 0% slope would be ideal for making sure that we can kind of have a flat, comfortable journey, you do need some slope, but making sure that it doesn't exceed the maximum of 2%. So one area that's hard to avoid this problem, and it's something that we could do a better job as designers and planners to think about, is a cross slope at driveways. And so a lot of times this happens because it's a private construction, or it's a bit of an afterthought, which it doesn't need to be, but sidewalks oftentimes run right into a driveway. And that's where there's a pretty extreme difference in the slope that goes from the sidewalk area down to the driveway. So the image on the right kind of shows what that dramatic change looks like, and could be a quite dangerous situation of being unsteady. But the two images on the left kind of indicate that we can do a better job of thinking of design from the beginning when it comes to providing sidewalk space that stays consistent as well as level. And so these two examples show the sidewalk actually going around the driveway slope change, so that as a pedestrian, you're prioritizing the situation and you have a steady level path to continue on. We also get into surfaces, and design is a great thing, and there's lots of options out there for what we can pick and select for the surfaces that we use in our designs and open space and public spaces. But it's really important to think about the user groups once again. So are those surfaces firm and stable? Are they slip resistant? Good surfaces to think about that are kind of supportive of everyone. Bricks, paving stones, those can work nicely. Concrete, asphalt, those are generally pretty level and can be maintained relatively easy. But making sure that there's no large openings such as cracks or just kind of grooves in those pavings. And then also thinking about the grates that we use. And so the image on the right with the wheelchair showing the vertical openings that a wheel goes straight into those openings, versus kind of thinking it oriented differently. Having the horizontal slats would be certainly a safer and better option here. So just thinking through these design decisions for everybody. So now we're kind of getting into a bit of street crossings and design solutions. The first, thinking about curb ramps and what's happening at the corner. And so we have certainly started paying a bit more attention, and perhaps you've done this a bit longer than us, but really kind of starting to look at what facilities are available on the corner. So what we see a lot in San Diego is that the curb ramp leads you right into the middle of the intersection. There's one ramp and it leads you right out to the middle. Where having two ramps, so these perpendicular options, would allow you to kind of go right out into the crosswalk area. And so image on the upper right shows these two ramp options, which would be more ideal. That allows you to roll right into a safe crossing area, where I will highlight that the image in the lower left, while there's good things happening there, that's kind of the example of you would roll out right into the middle of the intersection versus going right into a crossing area. But understanding that the good things happening on the lower left image is that we see that there's a gentle slope from the sidewalk area to the crossing area. So always trying to mitigate how severe those slope differences are to make sure that we stay as level and steady as possible. But then also trying to shorten the amounts of change happening. And then again, the examples in the lower and the upper right, just showing those two ramps kind of feeding into the crossing areas. So here's just another example of showing the perpendicular crosswalks. And then thinking about how easy or difficult it is to navigate. So once you're up or down the ramp, what does your journey look like? And so making sure there's enough of a landing area so that you can turn around or comfortably get out of the street area to make sure that you can continue on your journey safely. So this is where we kind of brought up before the idea of the visual and audible information. So these two images are really helpful of highlighting that for some, the walking speed is an issue. And so the crossing time for a pedestrian could be extended and suggested 3.5 feet per second. We've also seen up to 4 feet per second, but it really, all that means is that you're extending the amount of time a pedestrian has to cross the street. And then the image on the right shows the startup time is an issue. So notice that the pedestrian button, which is on the other side of that fire hydrant, this person with a visual impairment needed to first find that button and then needed to find the ramp that he would then go down and get into the crossing area. And so even if the pedestrian symbol turned on for him to cross, there's a time that he had to go from pressing this button to finding the ramp to then crossing the street. And so, as you can imagine, that time has already kind of ticked away. And so, another reason to have more time to cross the street, but also thinking about the design and orientation of these systems in order to kind of press that you need to cross the street. And that's what this one highlights, as well as thinking through what the push buttons look like and how they're designed. And so the image in the upper right shows kind of what a journey could be for someone that's perhaps a little slower moving or maybe has a visual impairment. That first you click the button, which it's a little bit small, but what it shows is how far it is from the actual crossing area. So you push the button and then maybe you make it back to the curb waiting for your light to change. But perhaps by the time you click the button and get to the curb, it already changed. And so then you need to go back and do this process again. So just thinking through what's the ease of use, what's the convenience, and again, just making sure that this experience is not overly tiresome or complicated or even dangerous for people to use. And then one thing to highlight too is the orientation of the push button, making sure that they are kind logically located. So making sure, when you press the button, is it clear that the button that you're pressing is for the direction that you want to go? And then also making sure what we've learned is that the push buttons that have the little metal circle is oftentimes hard for some people to use. And so if you can use a fist or a whole hand in order to press, that's something that is preferred. So the last couple of slides that we have here is crossing distance and Refuge. And so again, brought up Refuge the Refuge is highly supported and is a great opportunity to kind of help shorten crossing distances, provide space to rest, but then also for those who perhaps are a little bit slower moving, we can have additional push buttons for pedestrians so that you only have to navigate one leg of a crossing at a time. And so just trying, once again, and I know I said this many times, but as comfortable and safe as possible. So if that means that we need to just spend more time and resources thinking about the pedestrian environment as well as the bicyclist environment, in order to make everybody feel as safe and comfortable to do that, we certainly want to promote that practice as much as we can. Grade break, this is just wanted to provide this as very much an accessibility need, but we don't often think about the grooves or the design of a ramp or a curb area in terms of actually having the use of providing kind of a braking system for someone in a wheelchair. So sometimes we just see this as being a part of the ramp, but really kind of trying to change your mindset that for someone that's in a wheelchair, oftentimes this is what's preventing them from running into a street or running into something that could cause them harm. And so the design and purpose of these facilities is something just to kind of change our lens on what they mean in their purpose. And next couple of things are just talking about detectable warnings. So sometimes I just wanted to highlight, some people know what these mean and some people don't. So they're not just for traction, they are there to help the visually impaired understand when they're entering a hazardous area. So what this means is a street area. So they'll feel these rumbles, these detectable warnings with their cane or even underneath their feet. But that lets them know that they're entering an area where vehicles are present. And then once they feel those items again, they know that they're in an area that is pedestrian only. So it's a warning system. And this one, this is the last item that we have here for physical environment needs. And I bring this up, so protruding objects. So objects between 27 inches and 80 inches, so that's talking about in height, may not protrude more than 4 inches. And this is because canes need to be able to detect what's happening underneath, and then making sure that we're not hitting our heads because we can't see something. So really trying to think about these obstacles. And if you can imagine, if you can't see what's happening, there's obviously a lot to navigate in our world. And this one became especially important to talk about because during COVID, we've seen a lot of outdoor dining, which is fantastic, and we certainly support that. But making sure that we keep our pedestrian environments as clear as possible for all users, but also kind of thinking through this exact reason. There's some people who need that extra space, or at least just the space that is available and is rightfully theirs to use to navigate. And so as we design these great kind of adaptive reuses with using the sidewalk space for outdoor dining or gathering spaces, we still need to make sure that the pedestrian zone is as clear as possible and that we maintain it that way. So I just want to make sure that that was highlighted. And so the very last thing that I'll have here is thinking about the environments and behaviors. And this brings it back to safe users versus safe design. So as a community, there are certainly things that we can do a better job of thinking through, that you are sharing space with everyone, with all users, with all ability types, those that have physical or other needs. And so just wanting to make sure that we're doing everything possible when it comes to parking our scooters in responsible places, or locking our bike in a responsible way, that making sure that your tire doesn't block a sidewalk and it is where it should be. These are just behavioral things that we can do a better job of just making sure that it's a better experience for everybody. And so I just want to leave you with, this is kind of we're at a feedback stage when it comes to the committee, persons with disabilities, and that certainly goes for you as well if you have other feedback. We are not here to say that we are experts in this area, but we certainly are trying to do a better job of learning more and being more supportive of everything that we need to do as mobility professionals to think of everybody. And so just wanting to know kind of what resonated with you. We want to know what we've missed, what we can do a better job of learning more about, and just making sure that our transportation environment is safe for everybody, but really kind of spending a better job of thinking about our persons with disabilities. So where I will leave you is I'm going to launch one more poll. I'll kind of close this presentation in a second, but I just wanted to mention that we do have a VisionZero coalition meeting coming up on August 2nd, and I included on Halika's email. Generally, these meetings are open to everyone, but if this meeting in particular is about persons with disabilities in VisionZero goals, and so we just want to know if you are interested, feel free to email on Halika, and we'd love to have you at that meeting. So I'm going to stop sharing. And before we kind of go into a discussion, I just want to see if you learned something new. So if you don't mind just kind of taking this quick poll. Great. All right. Thank you for that. So where we're at right now is I'd love to see if there's any questions. I know we have a small group, so feel free to take yourself off mute if you'd like, but please let us know if there's any information that you have that you'd be willing to share with us, or if there's anything that I can clarify. Faye, I see that you have a question. Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to know, what can we do to get more sidewalks in our communities, especially around elementary schools, and also making sure that if there's no traffic lights, that we can put in more, get the money to put in more safe crossings. The problem we have in the community is we just don't have the funding to do what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you had a couple items in there, but sidewalks in particular. So a lot of cities, I'm not sure where in the county that you live, but many cities have apps similar to the Get It Done app or something similar. And it is an application that you can use on your phone, but it's a way to kind of indicate where there's a problem area. So a missing sidewalk or hazardous things happening that you need to report to the city. But those are oftentimes great tools that cities use to indicate where spending and resources need to be made from an infrastructure standpoint. So those apps are very much supportive of that. And many communities create sidewalk plans that indicate they're mapping where sidewalks are deficient and where new ones are needed. Not every city has one, but I do know that that is something that is being worked on as something for every community to have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Are there any other questions that we can help with, or even just discussion topics?
I think funding is always a big issue. And in our community, we're always told there's not enough money in our funds, in our DIF funds. I'm in the Torrey Pines area.
Okay. So City of San Diego. Yeah. No, absolutely. And another issue that we're seeing, throughout the county and we've been experiencing for a long time, and the prioritization of where projects lie with how they get addressed. And so biggest recommendation is just making sure that every funding cycle, those are issues that are raised. And I do know that Circulate San Diego often partners with many local organizations to make sure that mobility needs are continuously put on the priority list for annual funding. But community involvement and being vocal, while it's a lot of work, is extremely important. Yeah. Okay. Well, again, we really appreciate you all being here, and we always hope for as much discussion as possible, and hopefully you learn something new. But we are recording this, and so we have been adding all of our Mobility Mondays to our YouTube channel, so this will be included there as well. And we just really appreciate you being here, and hope that you stay in touch. While this is our last Mobility Monday, our work doesn't end after today, and so we're always looking for passion projects and ways to continue being a good organization for those that we work with and work for. So just stay in contact with us and let us know what we can do to partner and support you. So thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.